Welcome back. Electoral campaigns have begun in earnest in the Nigerian capital Niamey for next Sunday's polls. While banners and posters of the various candidates can be seen everywhere, electoral campaigns have been characterized by tensions. Residents, however, want peaceful elections and want leaders to focus on some of the country's challenges like drought and insecurity. Niger is just one of the at least 6 African countries holding presidential elections this year. There's Uganda, where President Yoweri Museveni has ruled for 30 years and is seeking another 5-year term. There's also Zambia, where President Edgar Lungu was in power earlier this year to serve out the remainder of Michael Sartor's term after his death in office. The DRC will be heading to the polls in November. A few weeks after the U.S. presidential election, President Kabila has ruled for 15 years and wants a 3rd term. Ghana's election comes up in December, and the 2 main faces will be seen at the polls, President John Mahama and the man he defeated in 2012, Nana Akufo-Addo. Finally, Somalia makes a list of countries to watch this year for presidential election. Remember, Al-Shabaab has dealt a blow to the country's political stability, leaving it struggling to protect its people. Now, I spoke to WANEP Executive Director Chukwuemeka Eze on the upcoming elections and Africa's other challenges. Let's talk about issues on the continent, of course. That's the reason for this discussion. There were 5 elections in West Africa in 2015. We're talking Nigeria, Togo, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and Cote d'Ivoire. Now, I know the WANEP also monitored these polls. What were your general views?
I think the continent and then the sub-region is coming to a certain level of security consciousness and then taking their destiny into their hands. And I think more and more, the regional economic communities, especially ECOWAS, is beginning to understand the relationship between elections and peace and security on the region. And I think the same also applies to African Union, that is taking its elections more seriously, not just in terms of election day observation mission, but also deploying ahead of the elections, working with civil society organizations such as WANEP to understand the intricacies of the election and begin to develop mechanisms for averting likely violence. If you look at the Nigerian election, for example, where a lot of people predicted that the election was going to be violent, I think one of the things that we as civil society advised and was carried out is to raise eminent persons that can speak to political actors to understand that they need a country before they can even govern. And I think by and large, Nigeria understanding also its role as one of the big countries on the continent, also knew that the relationship between the stability in Nigeria and the entire continent was so huge.
Do you think that elections are significant enough in Africa?
Well, election is just one aspect of democracy. I think what has happened over time is that if you look at where we started from the end of the Cold War and where we are today, we have made progress, obviously, at least to the extent that there's a semblance of people making choices for who their leaders are. And I use that word advisedly, a semblance. You know, while in some countries we still have sit-tight leaders, you know, namely Gambia, Cameroon, Equatorial Guinea, recently now even in Burundi. Look at what is happening also in Zimbabwe, and so on and so forth. But by and large, there is even periodic elections that take place in those countries, even if they are not exactly the wishes of the people, but to the extent that there is people's opinion in those elections, no matter how difficult it is to take them on board. I think we are making progress.
But is that enough? You know, in countries that you have just mentioned where you have sit-tight presidents who have become authoritarian, is it enough to just have elections and then, you know, they come back?
No, I think what the election does is that, especially in our continent, that we have had leadership deficits from when we stopped having the likes of the Ziks, the Nkrumahs, and so on and so forth. What has happened is that there are now ongoing discussions. ECOWAS, for example, in the last 2 summits, made a presentation to the Authority of Heads of State and Government to include term limit on the Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance. 13 countries out of 15 accepted. Of course, you also know how ECOWAS operates. The Authority of Heads of State and Government is not a democratic organization. It's a consensus organization. So because Gambia and Togo, even though you can argue that they are not the biggest of the countries on the region, because they said no at this moment, it is a no. So what that has created is the consciousness among civil society organizations to begin to push that envelope as far as they can to ensure that. But in the past, nobody could even discuss that. African Union is also beginning to make a move to say, look, this is our opinion about when your people say your tenure is up. And that's why they are taking the kind of stand they are taking in Burundi. And that's why they are advising strongly about what might happen in Rwanda. So there is we've not gotten to where we are going, but at least there are some levels of discussion going on, especially that the intergovernmental organizations in Africa have created a space for civil society to constructively engage them. And those civil society organizations are indirectly influencing policies on the continent today.
I want to take out two countries that you just mentioned, Burundi and Rwanda. Burundi, which has rejected the African Union peacekeeping force, the 5,000 troops that are supposed to come in and help to maintain some semblance of peace in the country as a result of, ethnic and political violence that erupted last April. And then Rwanda, where a referendum has shown that President Paul Kagame can go ahead and run for elections in 2019 and then, stay until 2029 or thereabouts. These two countries, what do you think is the solution at the end of the day?
Paul Kagame, for me, is personally, I feel so disappointed because in one of the popular speeches he made, when he was actually asked to stay back in power, he actually said that if as a leader he's unable to get somebody to hand over to, that for him that's a failure. And for Burundi, I think the president of Burundi can make those statements for now. But at the end of the day, there is something he signed on to, which is the principle of non-indifference that is operating on the continent today. Okay. So I think that what the current chair of the authority of African Union have done is to say, we will intervene, but without your conditions. Because Burundi wants to develop the conditions under which African Union will intervene. And African Union is making a bold statement by saying, no, we will intervene on the basis of the protocols governing the union, not under your conditions. And that's how it has happened over the years.
So how do you see it going? How do you see Burundi? How do you see the issues playing out?
I think that to the extent that we are not losing lives going further, and to the extent that the Peace and Security Council evaluates what is happening in Burundi as that which cannot lead to a national disaster and also engulf the entire region or continent, African Union will not intervene. But so long as these, for now, are some of the permutations, the standby force is ready to be deployed with or without his authority, except he opt out of African Union. And if he does, then United Nations might apply the Chapter 6. And that in itself is not good for the continent.
Even with a promise to shoot down those troops as they're landing, because that's what the government promised, that if the African Union troops arrive, then his own forces are ready to bring them down.
Well, normally what happens is that sit-tight dictators talk tough.
Okay.
I think a good example was in Cote d'Ivoire in 2010. Vehemently, the then President Gbagbo rejected the intervention of both African Union and ECOWAS. But when the chips were down, he was taken out of a hole. So I think at the end of the day, the Peace and Security Council will advise the Union on what to do.
Okay, let's come back to West Africa now. 5 presidential elections, Gambia, Cape Verde, Niger, Benin, and Ghana will be held. What indicators are you observing? And then what are your predictions for the elections? Let's talk about Ghana, first of all, where you're currently located.
Ghana has always presented the picture of the ideal state in Africa, where the democratic space allows both the ruling party and the opposition equal participation. But at the moment, I must confess that the pictures are not looking nice. There has been a lot of internal party wranglings, especially within the opposition political party. There has been a lot of suspicion of the ruling party in terms of the voters register The opposition has raised serious issues about some Togolese citizens being part and parcel of the voters register. The Electoral Commission has new leadership. It's no longer the then stubborn Afarijan who have come to understand the political terrain. So we have a new leadership on one side. The Peace Council, the chair of the Peace Council's tenure is ended. We are pushing for him to be retained because of the kind of job he's doing. The Police Inspector General is new to his position. So a lot of changes have taken place, and each of those changes comes with perception and counter accusations. But I think that if you look at the role that Ghana continues to play, providing example of a stabilized and a stable polity, the amount of work that is going on at the moment as I speak to you is good enough, in my opinion, to still allow Ghana to pull through. For the other 4 countries, Gambia is always dicey. ECOWAS at some point actually made a bold statement that they were not going to monitor the Gambia election for the simple reason, that was the last election, for the simple reason that according to them, the early warning indicators showed that there is no level playing ground, and therefore it was meaningless supporting an electoral process that in the first place did not provide equal opportunity for all the contestants. Benin, in my opinion, is good because there was a point that the president, Yaya Boni, was dancing the music of wanting to continue in power, but I think the pressure was too high. And because also he has also held the position of the chair of the Authority of African Union and played some very important role also in West Africa, I think he yielded to such pressure. So the spaces are there. ECOWAS have made it clear that they are monitoring Niger election in partnership with civil society. They will monitor Benin election in partnership with civil society. And I think that what has happened over the time is that ECOWAS have become more and more strong because they rely on their already made protocols to intervene in such conflicts.
Mull over these conversations and discussions and then tell us what you think. Send your comments to @diplomatic_chan or @CTV_Amara_Ubani or at facebook.com/diplomatic_channel. I am Amarachi Ubani. Thanks for watching.